Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Craig. I'm going to be moderating this next Blue Talk, which is all about the weather. Now, as an Englishman, you know full well as an Englishman, I can talk about the weather till the cows come home. Right? It's our hobby. It's our pastime. This Blue Talk isn't so much about how shipping's impacting the climate, but it's about how climate change and the weather is impacting shipping. So for the next 45 minutes, we're going to have a chat about how we see those factors that are impacting the shipping and how it affects the risk of the whole industry. We've all seen how climate change is impacting the oceans, how it's impacting trade, how it's impacting even storms. You know, we all hear about the perfect storm, of course. So I'm hoping with my experts on the stage with me, we're going to have this conversation so you can go away understanding a little bit more about how we perceive the impact of climate change on our industry. So to help us set the scene, I'm going to ask John Moore from the University of Lapland to come on. We've got with us a couple of climate scientists, we've got a data experts, we've got risk experts. So with them, I'm hopefully going to be able to enlighten you about all of these challenges. But first, John, if I could ask you just to set the scene for us.
Okay. Shall I start the slide?
Should work, yeah.
Okay. Right, thanks for coming to this. So I'm going to introduce a little bit about tipping points. And this was from a year or so, a couple of years ago. And they highlight where important, irreversible changes can happen to the climate and, of course, to the weather. And the color, you see the orange ones, are the things that are the closest to being triggered. And you notice that you probably can't see it, but that's less than 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial. As you may know, we crossed 1.5 degrees essentially last year. That's in the rearview mirror, really. So we're very concerned about the high latitudes, especially anything to do with ice and the permafrost and the sea ice. Now, you may think, well, why do I care about that? There's not a lot of shipping there. Well, the problem is, of course, when the ice sheet collapses, it raises sea level, it affects the ports globally everywhere, it drives huge amounts of migration, etc. Now, the other way of looking at this is from the deep past. When we look at an ice core record, this is an idea of how the climate has changed over the last 120,000 years. And the top bit, the relatively smooth bit, is the Holocene. That's the last 10,000 years. And you notice that there isn't a lot of wiggles on there compared with what's happening in the rest of the time. And that, not coincidentally, is the exact length of time that civilization, cities, agriculture have existed. Without a stable climate, it's impossible to put down roots to establish any kinds of settlement. If you look in the past, you got these big changes in the average temperatures every few thousand years, or even higher, shorter resolutions. That's how the Earth's climate usually is. We've been exceptionally lucky over the last 10,000 years in having it so stable. And of course, our worry is, as we put more greenhouse gases and move away from the observed record of how climate's been, that we're going to push it into another sort of unstable, chaotic type of regime in the future. And the tipping points and those changes are the kinds of things that can lead to this sort of chaotic behavior. So I'll leave that there.
Just before I bring in the panel, just a quick question on that. What's the difference when we talk about weather and when we talk about climate? Sometimes I feel we find those two are quite interchangeable, but they're not. I guess is there a scientific definition that we should be using?
Yes, there is, and climate is what you get when you average weather. And usually we talk about a 30-year average because you've got so much variability. Nowadays, people tend to look at even 20 years. because we haven't got a stable climate anymore. We're ramping it up. So it doesn't make too much sense to talk about what the average was between 1990 and 2020, when 2020 is so much warmer than 1990. Yeah. But the idea is to just remove some of that variability, but you can see you still have potential for large variability on all kinds of time scales.
I keep on hearing that we get a new extreme every year. It's the warmest January, it's the warmest February, it's the warmest June, it's the wettest, it's the driest. We seem to be almost running out of superlatives.
Well, this is what we get when you haven't got a flatlining, stable climate. You've got an ever-increasing trend, of course, driven by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the other point is that the more energy you put into the pot, like a pot of water on a stove, it becomes more bubbling and lots more circulation going on. Yeah. And that energy that's increasing in the system is what weather is. It's generating more of these extreme behaviors.
Good. So now we're going to bring that conversation and we're going to distill it down into how that's impacting the shipping industry. So if I could ask the rest of our panel to come up, please, and join us on the stage. So who we have here is Kikki Kleiven from the, how do I pronounce that?
Bjerknes.
Bjerknes Centre for Climate. We've got Kasper from the Mærsk Møller Centre, Dahle from Gard, so obviously the risk perspective. And with me also is Michael O'Brien from StromGeo. As you know, StromGeo does a lot of data, weather data. They originally started out as one of these weather routing, but have since expanded. So with these experts, I'm not the expert, they're the experts. My expertise is obviously in talking a lot. Hopefully not too much hot air, get the pun. Let's just kind of distill this into sort of shipping talk, if we like, and sort of find out what these, because John mentioned tipping points, but what are the key things that are impacting the shipping here? Maybe you're a scientific expert here. You do the research on boats. You go out there, you know, taking the pulse of the ocean. So tell us a little bit about what you see as sort of the main sort of points that are impacting us.
Well, I think we can feedback a little bit into each other, but what we are first and foremost, we're observing climate change. Tipping points are in the future. Climate change is real, it's here and now. It's a gray rhino, it's big, it's fat, and it's heading straight towards us. And we know it, and we know what's driving it. But what we are observing now is the extremes that it's giving us. It's changing weather patterns, it's changing ocean currents, it's making sea level rise. And if we look at the maritime alone, the worry, the fact that we are getting more extreme storms, stronger storms, we're getting stronger rainfalls that leads to flooding and closing of our harbors. And what we see that climate is often coming as a compound effect. So we have extreme weather and flooding at the same time. We see the heat waves, also maritime heat waves, which is a challenge for cargo, but it's also a challenge for working on the ships. And the heat waves in the Atlantic Ocean is actually caused by the change of fuels. The fact that we have fuels now with less sulfur and less particles. So there's less particles in the atmosphere, so the ocean's been heated up more in the Atlantic Ocean. And a lot of the marine heat waves that we're seeing now are caused by global warming and also changes in patterns in the atmosphere.
Was the use of sulfur fuel sort of hiding the real problem?
Absolutely. It's masking it. Yeah. And we see the same effect, actually, when India is now cleaning and getting cleaner and cleaner of their coal. That's actually affecting the Indian monsoon. It's changing the rain patterns. So we like to say that, you know, changes in Arctic, what's happening in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. What happened in the ocean, where all the weather on our planet is formed, is having cascading effects globally. Yeah. And it's safety, it's security, and it's also reliability it's affecting.
Yeah. Michael, from that point of view about the sort of the changing patterns, from StromGeo, obviously you've got the data, you look and you do advisory stuff to ships to sort of put them on the right course, literally. How do you see this change then? What's the sort of granular sort of changes that you are seeing here in terms of the patterns? I mean, are you rerouting ships yet because of climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the fact of the matter is yes. As Kikki mentioned, we're in climate change right now. And what we're seeing essentially is a shift northward or poleward in the primary load tracks. And what does that mean? It means that we have to alter our thinking about where ships are operating. And the paradox there is that as these load tracks generally lift to the north, it could mean that traditional routes, say from North Europe to North America, Canada, Northeast US, could ultimately be forced to go further south. So the paradox is the climate change is resulting in a northward shift in the load tracks, and then ships are going to have to tend to do longer routes to get to their destination. I think another key area where we're seeing it now is a increase in the freak wave activity off of South Africa.
Yeah.
So off of South Africa, again, with a poleward shift in the load tracks down there, you would think, oh, it's going to get better at the Cape of Good Hope. But what's actually happening is we're getting more intense areas of low pressure further south. As Kikki mentioned, the ocean currents are changing. The Agulhas current is getting more powerful, transporting that warmer water down south to try and get that homeostasis. The swells are battering up against this powerful ocean current, and ultimately we're getting much more freak wave activity. So those are some pretty fundamental examples.
Fundamental changes. I forgot to mention, though, that Kasper here is a former meteorologist as well. So he just told me a minute ago, he still gets asked by his colleagues at the Mærsk Møller Center, is it going to be raining at 5 o'clock when I go home? What are you doing then? An ex-weatherman at the Mærsk Møller Center. What are you doing there? Why?
Yeah, obviously not doing the weather at the Mærsk Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. But what we are concerned about is that whole transformation of the entire shipping industry, moving from fossil fuels to something that's a bit more green. And in that context, it's about everything going on the energy efficiency side, of course. Where do ships go? Where do they go most efficiently? It's about what kind of fuels are we putting into it. If you are on the more biofuel side of things, obviously you are affected by the climate change unfolding on the fields where you eventually are producing that biofuels. But we're also really concerned about how we move goods around the globe, because shipping as an industry is incredibly simple, but yet complex. Hence, you're moving goods from one port to another port, but from the transformation from one ship onto the port and what's going on there, that's also super critical for us. So basically saying that whenever you're having a ship offloading goods to a port, the conditions where you do that is incredibly important in case that you are requiring the resilience that you need.
Yeah. And one of the points there I've seen is a lot of ports now are, John alluded to rising sea levels, and you mentioned flooding. There's all of these impacts on the logistics infrastructure. So as well as just the ships at sea, it's the ships' efficiency coming in and out of ports as well, and the timing of that. But going back to the ships at sea now, from Gard is you look at it from a risk perspective. Talk to me about all of this from the headache of insurance and P&I.
Yes, of course. And when the scientists worry, we worry in the industry as well in insurance. We are a mutual marine insurance company. We have some sort of insurance on roughly 50% of the world tonnage. So we have quite a big range, and we're part of the international group of P&I clubs that insures actually 90% of the world tonnage. So clearly, we pay attention. I think traditionally, insurance pricing has been like, looking in the rearview mirror and trying to predict the future. But of course, what's happening now is greatly impacting how we try to predict risk going forward as well. So it means completely different use of data, different types of data. We have an enormous amount of data related to claims. We try to then pair it with other types of data and actually prevent losses from happening.
What can you tell ship owners now about these risks? Are you in a position yet to be able to turn around to say, come on, this is what you can do to, I'm not talking about clean fuels, I'm talking about making your fleet sort of ready to mitigate this.
Okay, let's be concrete. So we have a couple of, you mentioned safety culture and navigation. I mean, we have a couple of very concrete initiatives. We collaborate with a company, Nav2, they're right over here, in fact, where, based on our data, we can identify hotspots. Where do accidents happen right now, and for what reason do they happen? And we're now able to feed that information directly to the bridge as a decision support for the crew on board. And then I think you mentioned crew and safety culture, and regardless of what's going to happen, safety culture, how people on board vessels are actually trained, prepared, the knowledge they have to to handle the altering world is actually quite important. So we also, pair with a company that does exactly that.
Kikki?
No, exactly. And you mentioned Novtur, which we hope to have a really, really exciting AI project with, because we need to use new technology. So shipping and the insurance companies have to use forecasting and predictions in a completely different way than what they're doing today. They have to build in that knowledge and build a whole sort of value chain. And the training has to be training for the unknown, because the future climate is unknown. And the extremes that we know today are not the extremes of the future. So to prepare for that and have that knowledge sharing is perhaps the most important thing that we're going to do. Openness, knowledge sharing, and building protocols for mitigation.
So we're going to have even more superlatives.
No, I was just going to say that we actually do know a fair bit about the future. It's not a complete blank paper. But some of the places, for example, I know more about sea level than other aspects. And it's the northeast US has surprisingly large amounts of sea level to look forward to in the future, and also increased frequency of hurricanes or tropical cyclones making their way up there, which is quite an interesting perspective. And insurance-wise, it's always incredible to me that the budget for adaptation, coastal adaptation to flooding, is about 20 times less than the flood damage is going to cause, which makes you think if people spent a bit more, twice as much on actual protection, they would avoid 10 times more in flood damage costs. It's a strange human psyche thing, I guess.
And I see what you mean. And I don't know anything about land-based, or very little at least, about land-based insurance, but for sure on vessels, we definitely know that it's much cheaper to prevent an accident from happening than actually, mitigating it afterwards, which is why, the role of insurance is really changing, right? We are more about sharing data, sharing our knowledge, sharing insight to make decisions.
Yeah. Isn't Bergen going to vanish?
No,
No.
because we were pushed down during the glacial.
Okay.
So where we are now, Oslo, is rising 5 millimeters per year.
Is it?
With a global
Okay.
sea level rise of 3 millimeters, the opera is safe.
All right. I remember
So
seeing something a couple of years ago about water levels flooding Bergen Harbour, and they're needing to put a wall across.
Where we have, of course, we have with the surge.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
with stronger winds and stronger storms, that surge is going to hit the historical parts of town. So we need to build a wall as well.
Okay.
But we should start learning from the Dutch. They started planning this a long time ago. For instance, Rotterdam Harbor. They already planned it, right? They're already planning what's going to happen to their bridges when sea level is rising. So, we got to learn from the Dutch.
Are we designing the ships in the right way? Can we talk a little bit about how the ships are going to need strengthening? We talked about extreme storms. The idea is the ship doesn't head into the storm, but occasionally they do go into the storm inadvertently. Storm patterns may go in the wrong way. So what about the design of the ships in the future? Do we need to look at that?
Yeah, of course it is. Obviously, the best way to avoid it is to steer out of the storm. I think let's head there first. But whenever we are designing new ships, and there's going to be a lot of new ships over the next 25 years, we know more or less the conditions which they will operate in, both on the northern hemisphere, but also on the southern hemisphere. So therefore, whenever we have a ship design team, obviously they are looking at what climate trends and what climate that ship will be operating in. And for that case, it's fairly easy, if one would say so, because we know what we're heading for. It's the sea level rise, not necessarily a concern for the ship sailing on water. But obviously, whenever you're connecting to ports on one side, the storm surges and the stronger winds, and indeed the freak waves, is a thing that our ship design team is looking at, indeed. But the great thing is that whenever you have an opportunity to redesign your entire fleet, in that case over the next 25, 30, 50 years, you also have an opportunity to really mitigate many of the risks that you're talking about here.
And is there a need here, maybe this is a question for Lena and Michael here, about weather routing, about making it a mandatory kind of requirement that vessels have a good weather routing plan so that they are prepared to avoid the unexpected weather pattern change?
Well, I can...
Please.
quickly comment from us. I think liability insurance, which I represent today, we're set up to meet the ocean regulations. So the IMO basically regulates the ocean, and there are conventions, and there are safety conventions, the MARPOL and the SOLAS, and our ship owners adhere to that. And there was a panel here earlier, and it's this continuous evolving regulatory regimes that need to happen, and we are set up to respond to that.
Right.
So, from our perspective, that's a good thing.
So to have something that's a little bit more making ship owner mandatory, something mandatory to make ship owners more aware of these risks would be helpful.
I'm not the one to answer whether it should be mandatory, but I think prudent owners do what's necessary, right?
Well, Michael.
Yeah, I think connecting back to what you were saying earlier about the insurance and trying to understand where risks were, looking at past data, and to do AI projects, it brings up an interesting point, right? Because we talk about training models, we talk about training on data sets, and a lot of that is based on AIS data, right? So AIS has been mandatory for about 20, 25 years. And during that time, we've seen a rather rapid change in the global climate. So I think when it comes to training these models and seeing where accidents have traditionally happened and where they're going to happen in the future, it has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, because with the shifting weather patterns, a route that was safe 15, 20 years ago is not necessarily going to be safe today. So I think when you're looking at AIS data, it's looking at, was it an ENSO year? Was it El Nino? Was it La Nina? How long ago was that data point? You have to put more weight on more recent years because we're getting more of an almost exponential change compared to the 90s into the early 2000s. So absolutely, I think there's a very close connection between the decision making for voyages planning and the insurance industry. And then maybe briefly on the ship design, I think it's going to be super important, right? Because again, as the low tracks are changing, vessels are going to want to be operating on a reasonably efficient route as long as possible. And in order to do that, they're going to have to be strengthened. And we're looking at the Northern Sea route more often, minus the Ukraine-Russia war. But once that's hopefully resolved, then we're going to be seeing more voyages up there, meaning we need more ice-class ships. And eventually going north of Canada is going to become an option as well. So the ice design for that area as well.
And just to be concrete again, thank you for that. That was, so one of the hotspots we identified, in the container ship industry, container stack collapses are quite frequent. And one of the sort of correlations we see is between exactly wave height and at what point
container
afterwards
losses.
do these container stacks collapse and the containers fall overboard, right? And this is the kind of information that you can then share with the world, like we do, and even get it up on the bridge.
We're talking there, just to clarify that, it's when large container ships, they hit the storm, they hit a parametric rolling condition, and sometimes it can be so strong that the containers, and we've seen reports, I've written about reports of increased container losses in the industry because of these storms, and the vessels operators not really perhaps understanding.
Exactly, and we kind of get into the picture when the accident has happened very often, right? So we know exactly when, what weather led up to this happening, and then the container stack collapse or whatever. If we can, get that information out there, that would help.
Yeah, and the costs are also phenomenal. I mean, so one thing is loss out in the open ocean. Another thing is coming into a port with extreme flooding and weather hitting it, and you're stuck there with your cargo. It's perishable. It's going to cost a fortune to try to get it on land, and it's not possible. And we see this has happened. Ports in the South America closed last year. I can't remember the name of it, but it's $240 million in cost. For a couple of weeks without that port going. So it's phenomenal.
I was talking to an insurance company probably about 6 months ago, and as well as the container losses, they were having, and it might have been Gard, I can't remember which insurance company it was, but they were getting concerned with how the goods are stored in the container, because quite often they were getting the container ashore, not late, but opening up the container, and it's a mess in there. All of the goods hadn't been lashed properly, so the whole container cargo was destroyed because the vessel had been hitting worse weather than anticipated, and the container hadn't been lashed or the goods hadn't been stored properly because of that.
And at the end of the day, we pay for it, right?
Yeah.
So there is a forest of companies, coming up now with these sensors to be placed inside containers. And it's interesting, of course, to know when the accident happened, but it would have been better if it didn't happen at all, and the containers were packed accordingly, right?
But that's what we want. Just one of your slides, John, it's pointed, I can't remember, it's a very scientific phrase about the swirling oceans in the middle of the Atlantic. What was the phrase?
AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation.
That was it.
Yeah.
That tie into what Michael was saying about El Nino and La Nina.
In a sense, they are natural variations in the circulation of the ocean on the planet, which is all about distributing heat from the tropics to the poles.
Right.
And the strength of that variation, or what's optimal for the planet to do, depends on what the boundary conditions are, like the surface inflow of fresh water into the oceans. And that's a worry. With all of these things we've talked about, essentially, they are smooth variations. But when you get a tipping point, you get a sudden jump into a regime without any previous experience. And that's when you get the real serious kinds of risk of damage. And I think a lot of what we've talked about, if you're not careful, it can lead to complacency where you can think that, because we've done it in the past in this way, it means that we know how to do it in the future. And that's tremendously difficult for human nature to sort of really estimate the uncertainty and the degree of ignorance that we've got at any one time. I mean,
but the challenge with tipping points is they're really into the future. we'll pass 1.5 degrees in 10 years from now. So they're into the future. I think we have to face the here and now, because climate change is happening here and now. It's the weather weirding, it's the extremes, it's the crazy new waves. They will get even worse if our ocean currents are changing even more than they're doing today. But it's the here and now that is the cost. It's the here and now that is require what kind of ships we're going to build in the future. And it's the here and now that's going to, to the companies out there, train their staff for the here and now and the extremes in the future.
But I would say that when you're looking at timescales of 20, 30 years in the future, that is absolutely in the range of some of these tipping points. So it's no good thinking that we build something for the present day and think it's going to be okay in 20 years' time.
How much, Kasper, in terms of the centre, obviously you put out all of these papers for the industry to sort of digest and get better understanding. Be honest with me, if you put out something about weird weather or the impact of climate on shipping, how well do you think it's going to be received at the moment? How much do you really, like Kikki says, get the industry aware and think they need to read that report? I'm not talking about doing the report, I mean getting the eyes onto the report and taking it seriously.
I think if you are talking to many of the even mid-sized and larger companies, of course, that's the thing they are dealing with, at least on the top level for now, because it's a risk coming onto a business. And if there's a risk coming onto a business, there's an appetite to mitigate that risk. So if you look at the broader industry, indeed, I think there will be an appetite to look at this for now. I think the thing with climate change is that it's like supercharging the conditions that we live in. So in that case, it's around operating business as usual on a slightly different way, and that continual ability to adapt to that. Yeah. But I think one of the key things is that now we are based in Norway, and I'm from Denmark, talking about a really flat country exposed to sea level rise. But our ability in the northern hemisphere to adapt to future climate change or even current climate change is quite easily. It's a question of cost, risks, and maybe part-time insurance. But if you go to some of the places where we also are having quite a few projects in the center, places like Chile, Namibia, Philippines, I know we have a delegation in Ghana right now, the ability, both financially but also in terms of building the right stuff, to adapt on a port level to the future climate changes is quite different from what we see in the northern hemisphere.
How much would it take for a port to change its infrastructure in a developing country like that? It sounds to me like it could be quite a long time for, first of all, identifying what they should do, then raising the funds on a national level, and then being able to actually enact on that. Have you got any sort of ideas on sort of timescales that you might be looking at?
We're actually in the center now doing a specific ports project, looking at who are the leading ports across the world and how they are distributing that knowledge across the globe to others. I think we are not coming up with an exact estimate of how much it's going to cost, because that's more adaptation than mitigation, and we care a bit about more about mitigation. But what I think is important is that whenever you're going to a port somewhere across the globe, there's going to be huge investments over the coming 25 years, whether or not it's going to be in fuel infrastructure, whether or not it's going to be in new ports adapting to sea level rise. And I think one of the key takeaways from this is that once you're doing your new investments, make sure that that investment is adapted to future climate change, because I'm sure that you could ask John, and he will be more or less accurate in what will happen over the next 25, 50, or even 100 years from now on. And it is indeed our expectation that that port will continue to operate over that timescale.
That's what I was thinking of in terms of how forward-thinking the industry is.
I think it's quite easy to map out the costs. Whenever you are mapping out the costs, sort of the ability and the willingness to do something suddenly becomes quite high. So I do expect, especially the larger companies operating both on deep sea, but also delivering that logistics to maybe not last mile, but close to last mile. And in that case, that given container is exposed to climate change from leaving the port somewhere to eventually going on land and then delivered to the customer. I think one of the great examples of that is the major floods that occurred in Germany, 5, 6 years ago, where they suddenly have freak intensity of rain, and all the warehouse or logistics located close to the Rhine suddenly flooded, in that case, causing a huge cost, maybe for you, Line, that will be up for you to reply on, but I think that's the connection we will see. And as soon, at least that's my understanding, as soon as a given company is hit with that the first time, you would see that trickle down throughout the organization.
Michael.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that, because when we talk about the climate change right now, the systems that are out there are more moisture laden, generally speaking. And as a result, we are seeing increased flooding in these coastal facilities. So we're talking about building facilities and thinking about this stuff in the future. But right now, it's important to understand how these events are going to impact you, as Kikki was saying. So I think it's a balance of both. So for us, we're working with a company based here in Norway called 7 Analytics. And between the two of us, we're providing data to municipalities, cities, port facilities, to understand the risk of inundation, whether it's from a coastal event, or perhaps river inundation, and flooding from rain events. So I think the concept of being prepared for flooding is really important now, because climate change is introducing much more moisture into the atmosphere, and it's being deposited into these areas that we're all doing commerce in on a daily basis.
You just raised a good point there, because a lot of ports are actually on river estuaries. So you get the flood coming down the river, and that will have an impact. It doesn't need rainfall in the port area, it's rainfall up in the mountains that could impact it.
And just a basic comment about insurance, it's the fundamentals of having insurance is that something unexpected happens, right? And unforeseen. So at one point, there's going to be a lot of more foreseen incidents happening here that insurance will not cover. Probably.
We saw last year another incident that kind of points to this conversation, and that was when the Panama Canal decided that you can't bring ships of a certain draft. Basically, they lifted the draft limit and said, rather than about 15 meters draft, the maximum draft is 13 meters, because the lake in the middle of the Panama Canal didn't have enough water, so the Panama Canal couldn't take as much tonnage. There was less vessels going through, and that had a huge impact on a lot of ships that suddenly had to sail around the south of America. I mean, how much is that likely to sort of continually impact what we're looking at here? Have you sort of, maybe Kasper or John, have you looked at impact of the Panama Canal and other key infrastructures for shipping?
Yes, we have, but in the case that Panama Canal is obviously a fairly genius thing, so you don't have to go all the way down. I think what's interesting for us is that is the thing that occurs currently. It was 2023, 2024, under a fairly big El Nino, but under current climate conditions. But if you're talking about that event, there's something called the World Weather Attribution, which I'm sure you are both aware of, and they looked at that event. Basically, they compared the temperature, the moisture, the rainfall everything to see, can we track climate change in this event? And actually what they came up with was that sort of the footprint of climate change in the Panama drought was actually not that big, which is a surprise, at least to me. But if you just fast forward 20, 30 years, in case that climate change would hit that directly, then obviously the courses will be fairly different. I know that the Panama Canal are doing a lot of work in trying to redirect rivers and dams and try to hold as much water into that lake as possible. But that is a lot of, one would call it climate adaptation, ongoing to make sure that the Panama Canal will be fully operational also going forward. But I'm not sure what the cost will be, but I'm quite sure they are high.
I think they are. I saw a report that the Panama Canal Authority is trying to enlarge its water catchment area so that it can create more reservoirs of water to put into that. And that's got a negative impact on the people in Panama because they then get less water for their agriculture or some of their key industries.
There's something around people and a lot of around biodiversity that we tend to look a bit away from whenever we're doing these kind of big projects.
We just got about 8 minutes. Another point you had on your slide there, John, was around the Amazon, the rainforest, and about destruction of the rainforest. But I can also tie with that the discussion about how we see crop yields and therefore bulk trades, so grain and soy and oils and biofuels and stuff like that. Talk to me a little bit about how climate change could be impacting the trade patterns that we see ships moving on.
Well, of course, as the climate changes, then areas will change their most valuable crop. I mean, that's just how farmers will adapt. But they will adapt rather differently in different parts of the world. You know, from what I'm told, an African farmer has a very different view of and flexibility in seed choices and practices than maybe some farmer in China, for example. So there are huge differences. There's no one size fits all to how those changes will be adapted to by the societies wherever they are. But of course, in general, we will see heat stress limiting a lot of the crops that are grown, especially the staple foods in different parts of the world. It will, in fact, that's all I can say. They will change. The details, I think, are so hard to put in because of the human element involved in those choices.
Kikki, did you have something to add to that?
Not really. I mean, again, we're changing. Again, it's not just the ocean that are changing. I mean, the latitudinal changes on land are phenomenal. And we're seeing large changes in the inner part of the continent. I mean, if you look at US and the corn yield, we know that once you pass 1.5 degrees, going up towards 2 degrees, you can risk 30% less production. Okay. So, and then you have the issue with large parts of North Africa, large parts of the regions in Saudi Arabia where they're using groundwater to grow. Well, that groundwater is not being replenished. It was last replenished during the Ice Age. So there's a lot of regions that in the future are not going to produce what they're producing today.
Michael.
Yeah, I was going to say that what John, you were saying, I think there's, we can learn from history here. If we look back a little bit, 12th century BC, we had this, the Bronze Age collapse, right? And what happened then? There was a massive change in climate. All those ancient societies in the Eastern Mediterranean all traded much the same way we do today. It was a very global society. And when those climate change came and you had migration of different people, it created wars. Food wasn't available. So I think we have to be a little bit naive to realize that the same thing couldn't happen now. Maybe not to the same scale, but we have to be aware that these changing patterns are going to be massively disruptive to society. And in fact, if you look at the World Economic Forum, in the short term, the #1 risk, and this is amazing right, when you think about it, in terms of we have wars in Ukraine, we have concerns about cyber attacks. The #1 risk right now, or pardon me, the #2 risk in the short term is extreme weather events. And in the long term, in the 5 to 7 year range, the top 2 are climate related. #1 is weather extremes, and #2 is tipping points. So you know, the world is very much focused on this.
Would that also impact a phrase that I came across, climate migration?
Yeah.
People's having to move elsewhere because the climate makes it, where they are, uninhabitable.
Absolutely.
Well, not long ago, there was a meeting at the Nansen Center here in town, which is not the climate center, but the human center, where I met...
Sorry, the nonsense.
The nonsense. You know, like Fritjof Nansen.
Okay, just checking.
Nonsense. The point is, there were representatives from Bangladesh, right? And what are they saying? They're saying, where are we going to move? And how are we going to have the means to move? We're stuck where we are. And you see most of the migration of people due to climate change and weather extremes is to the neighboring country and back again, or out of their county and hopefully back again. So this mass migration, I do not like to talk about it because it's often used politically and it's not real. And I don't think it's going to happen in the future. I think we need to help people where they are because they don't have any way of getting up here.
Do you think, though, that it will impact... Sorry, go on.
No, go for it.
No, I was just wondering about whether it will, because the other aspect of that is we see a lot of people who are moving to coastal cities as well, major cities becoming even bigger, because that not only impacts where shipping picks up the goods, but how much of it needs to take to individual places. So I'm sort of bringing it back to that trade pattern again of how we see more and more people localized in certain megacities in the future.
Well, around 50% of the world's population are living in major cities today. By the end of the century, we're expecting 75%.
Right.
So that's a huge change, which also will, of course, affect the whole transport chain.
Yeah.
And the fact is that I fully agree that it's good to help people where they are, but if your house is flooded by the high tide every day, that's not really tenable. You have to move somewhere. Economists generally assume that only 3% of a population will migrate from the global south to the global north. But even that turns out to be the single largest economic impact. Not so much flooding the fields or anything, but just the migration from the poor countries to the rich countries. No matter how moral that kind of a thing is, but that's what they cost it as.
Just briefly, again, on that point, and it's the people in most need typically that are impacted by this. If you look at Bangladesh, I think we were talking about that beforehand. Bangladesh, we see sea rise, and we see with climate change, we get additional accumulated cyclone energy in the tropical areas, and it's depositing more rain on these already rising sea levels. These people that are most at need are impacted the worst, unfortunately.
Yeah. Good. We've got 2 minutes left. On this. I'm going to end on the risk side again, Lena. So, bringing this back to the shipping industry, just some final words about how you're perceiving this sort of conversation from a risk perspective, because you are looking at your clients, your customers, who are the shipping companies, and they need the assurance that you're kind of on board with this conversation, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, I love this conversation. I think, you know, we've been around since 1907, and we're owned by the ship owners, and we're going to be here to finance these transitions. I think one takeaway for me here is that we need to do more of what we already do, partner with the different entities like you guys and scientists, and get more data into our data and use that data for actionable insight out there in the industry. I think that, and just one final word, I think that, you know, it's turbulent times, and I think what governs us, our institutions, we need to keep faith in these institutions and just, you know, believe in our regulations, follow them, adhere to them, and develop them together. That's really important. Otherwise, you know, this is not going to go well. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to the five. Could we say a big thank you to my experts on the panel here? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.